Welcome to this deep dive workshop on green finance for cleaner energy in Southeast Asia, innovation and acceleration. I'm Camilla Fenning, working for the British government as Director of the Southeast Asia Climate and Energy Network. I also lead the UK's Asean Low Carbon Energy Programme, which is focused on green finance and energy efficiency. We're working to strengthen policy and regulation on green finance and renewable energy with ASEAN countries. For example, we're advising governments and regulators on green and sustainable bond issuance, and also how to establish the green finance architecture a country needs to improve green finance flows. So thank you very much for joining us, and in particular, thank you to our panelists. We have a brilliant lineup of experts bringing together representatives from ASEAN regulators and ministries, regional investors, foundations working on grid infrastructure investment and financial innovations, experts working on COP26 sustainable finance and green finance development programs in the UK. We will address two questions through two panel discussions and subsequent dialogue and Q&A. The first panel will address what are the financing needs for energy transition in Southeast Asia and where are the priority investments needed. And then the second panel will address how can capital markets be mobilized for investments in energy transition. So we hope this will be a lively knowledge sharing session, and we invite you please to contribute your questions, comments and your expertise. It's been a really exciting week at ASEF, inspiring on the progress and potential of clean energy, but also highlighting the need to do so much more. And the key to this is, of course, finance, green finance in particular. And with the current strain on government budgets to protect health, jobs, livelihoods, ease of access to private capital is even more vital. Green investment can make ASEAN a resilient, green economic powerhouse that can provide jobs and provide returns for investors. So this session is also a conversation about green recovery in Asia, how we can accelerate a clean and more resilient future and not lock in fossil fuels for generations, how we can find the $3 trillion ADB estimate the region needs within just the next 15 years to upgrade its infrastructure to withstand the impacts of climate change, and how a green recovery will benefit Asia's economies, jobs, environment, and lift people out of poverty, particularly women and disadvantaged groups. Mobilising green finance is also a priority for the UK's presidency of the UN climate talks, COP26. We're launching a number of campaigns in Asia to help shift financial flows towards climate resilient and low carbon investment. And you'll hear more about that today. So the first panel will be facilitated by Kavita Sinha. Kavita is the Director in charge for Southeast Asia Energy Transition Partnership, a multi-donor and multi-philanthropy initiative for energy transition in Southeast Asia. She's also an advisor to Southeast Asia Clean Energy Facility. The second panel will be facilitated by Gilles Pascal. Gilles is a partner at EY, Ernst & Young, and leads the delivery team of our UK ASEAN Low Carbon Energy Programme that I mentioned earlier. Gilles has 20 years experience in Asia as a senior banker and consultant in the power and renewable sector before joining EY, and has been involved in green finance across project development and investment, financing, strategy and regulation. So thank you very much and enjoy the deep dive workshop.
Could you tell us, Paula, about the infrastructure and investment challenges for energy transition in Philippines, the priorities the government has set, the actions they're taking, and the key bottlenecks you see in addressing those?
Hi, Kavita. Thank you for that. In the Philippines, right now, as of 2018, our total renewable energy supply mix is around 33.1%. And from the years 2009 to 2018, around 909 renewable energy projects were awarded, with a potential capacity of around 31,635 megawatts. But the Energy Department estimates that by 2040, we would be needing around 43 gigawatts of additional capacity. So, from the perspective of the Department of Energy, of course, their mandate is to enhance energy security and ensure that we have energy sustainability and energy security. At the same time, we also understand that it is not just the Energy Department's sole task to enable the increase in renewable energy investments in the Philippines. That is why we have been working with the UK government through their green finance program to help our agencies come together, like the Finance Department, Economic Development Authority, your Energy, Transport, and Climate Change Commission, and as well as the Securities and Exchange Commission and the Central Bank, to come up with a green finance roadmap to help not only the energy sector, but other sustainable projects. Now, in the Philippines, since we are a growing economy and due to the impact of the COVID pandemic, we're actually seeing a lot of problems in terms of connectivity, in terms of supplying enough energy, especially of those in the off-grid areas. So these are the investment challenges that we're looking into. One of the main issues, even before the pandemic, for renewable energy was that most private proponents say that the risk attribution is very high. At the same time, your cost of capital is also high. So what the Finance Department, together with the Central Bank and the SEC, is trying to come up with is a way for us to solve these problems by enabling private capital or easing how risk management could be better complied with. So aside from these, the main issues in the Philippines right now is actually infrastructure for off-grid areas. Like how do we enable sustainable facilities that would help off-grid areas, not just in terms of solar, wind, but exploring other means of technology that would be better adaptable for their geographic location. So aside from these, the challenge of now being that almost all transactions are happening online. Like even your school system is being looked into so that we could transfer them to online platforms is also quite difficult, because a number of areas in the Philippines, for example, like those in the rural areas, do not have connectivity in terms of not only your internet connection, but also power security. So other islands are still suffering from not enough energy supply. So to address this, just recently, the president just signed the Energy Efficiency and Conservation Act, which would actually enable the Department of Energy to come up with a roadmap together with other agencies to help the Philippines secure a more efficient energy plan. And how do we enable the renewable energy investments to come in the Philippines? So this is what we're working in hand together as well with EY and the consultants from the UK Embassy. So thank you.
Thank you, Paula. Thank you, Paula. This was very interesting to hear that the needs of the economy is 43 gigawatts by 2040. And you mentioned about the need to invest not only in the generation side, but also the infrastructure behind it. You also mentioned something very important, that it's not just the Energy Department's responsibility, but the entire government systems, including the finance, capital market regulators, environment, and others. Thank you for those. I will turn now to Ms. Nguyen Ngo, the Executive Director from the Vietnam Initiative for Energy Transition. Nguyen, can you explain to us what are the priorities in Vietnam, what is being done so far, and what constraints do you see in meeting these challenges?
Yeah. Hi, everyone. Thank you for inviting me to this panel. So from my point of view, Vietnam needs larger capital to invest in the developing clean energy projects and upgrading the power grid as part of this government. Go ahead. What? So hello.
Well, we will. There seems to be a little bit of a problem. We will come back to the Vietnam specialist views in a minute. I'll turn actually to Andrew now to see, Andrew, what do you think? What are the new trends in investments in the energy transition, and how can some innovations from international experience, or also some of the things that you are working on, can be of help to the countries here?
Thanks, Kavita. And I mean, first of all, to all my fellow Singaporean residents, happy Phase 2 Day. I hope you all get a chance to go out and enjoy some fresh air later. Kavita, I think just a couple of points which I'd like to make relevant to your questions is that Armstrong, the firm I work with, we've been investing in primary renewable energy infrastructure across Southeast Asia for the last 10 years. And it's been around building new solar, wind predominantly. But I think the key change now and what's needed is we need to broaden everything out. And we've heard across multiple sessions this week and the need for greater solutions and policies which incentivize private capital in buildings and transport and these other areas. A great report that came out this week from REN 21 highlighted just how little progress we've made in some of the other areas. And Gilles earlier talked about the progress, but still Southeast Asia was lagging behind. In the heating and ventilation, of which, of course, aircon is a massive part of the issue in Southeast Asia, total final energy consumption only expanded from around 8 to 10% over the last 5 years globally in buildings. In transport, renewable energy only accounts for about 3%. So I think, funds and investors like ourselves really need to have the mandate broadened out now. And that's where we've got to work with policymakers to give feedback to how, and as Paula said in the Philippines, how can we look at a more holistic picture? Of course, primary energy is a key driver. I mean, it's a need to continue to support energy demand. But I think we need a more holistic view, and we need to broaden it out to incorporate sort of buildings and transport. The second point is enabling infrastructure. And, I think we're already seeing some of the unintended consequences of the progress we've made, for example, in Vietnam, and that's around the grid and curtailment. The grid stability and curtailment is obviously a foundation, a core, if we're going to continue to build out renewable energy infrastructure. But if we just touch back on transport, enabling infrastructure, EV charging, policy around tighter deadlines for transition to electric vehicles, electric mobility. This goes again back to the broadening. I think the money that will come in as this broadens out, I mean, certainly we're starting to see it globally, but hopefully there can be more initiative in Southeast Asia, is sovereign wealth money. And I think that, there are a number of stakeholders engaged today and have been throughout this week, that we need the scale and we need the money to come in before projects and businesses can transition to capital markets or can avail themselves of the debt markets, the green bond markets. So it's back to a very common theme of who takes the early stage risk. And again, that is a collaborative approach between public and private sectors to create the right incentives, policy and frameworks to incentivize private capital as well as public capital to take that early stage risk. Sovereign wealth, really, I think just a last point, I think what's a great trend that's happening at the moment, and we can use Norway as an example. Norway's sovereign wealth fund is the largest in the world, and over $1 trillion in assets under management. They made the commitment last year to divest fossil fuels, and that would mean exiting over 13 billion US worth of investments. I think closer to home, we see Temasek getting involved. In India, they have a new business venture with EQT, and that's targeting 4 gigawatts of power. So, to summarize, the key points are we need to broaden out. We still lag in primary energy, and that is still the most important for policymakers, but I think we need to broaden that out to make sure buildings and transport. And I think with the right frameworks, we need to crowd in larger funders like sovereign wealths who can take the lead in some of this enabling infrastructure. So a few points, hopefully that's helpful. Back to you, Kavita.
Thank you, Andrew. Thank you, Andrew. That was a really very good summary of what Thank you, Andrew. That was very good summary of what really the order of magnitude of the challenge here is, and the fact that the private sector and lots of investors are willing to come in, but you need a long view of the policy and the mandate to do more than what you're doing now. The need for some of the larger sovereign wealth fund type of organizations to come in to set the early stage, take the early risk to enable the crowding in of the massive scale of investment that is needed. You also talked really about broadening the horizon of energy transition more than just the power side into the systems, the storage, the building, transport, etc. Excellent summary there. I will go back to Nguyen now to talk about the Vietnam's view, what the Vietnam priorities are for investments, and what are the constraints that the country is seeing in the energy transition status that they are in currently. Nguyen, please.
Yep. Yes. Thank you, Kavita. So from my point of view, Vietnam needs larger capital to invest in the developing clean energy projects and operating the power grid as part of its energy transition plan. The Vietnamese government initially planned to further increase the share of renewable energy in the total electricity production to 33% in 2030 and 43% by 2050. And recently, in February 2020, the Politburo of Vietnam have issued the Resolution 55 to orient Vietnam National Energy Development Strategy to 2030 with the vision to 2045, which defines the prioritization of the fast and sustainable energy development while aiming foster favorable conditions to all economic sectors, particularly the private sector, to participate in the energy development. And the resolution further aims to eliminate subsidized, monopolized, and unfair competition in the energy sector. According to the updated revised power development plan in June 2020, up to now, Vietnam has about 4.5 gigawatt solar installed capacity in operation, and the planning for 2030 would be around 20 gigawatt. For the green energy, it's also developing rapidly. Up to now, we have 350 megawatt in operating And by 2030, it will be almost 16 gigawatt. And the total biomass power installed capacity is about 350 megawatt, with a big potential of waste to energy. And the power grid system needs to be extended and upgrade to integrate clean energy project. And last but not least, the investment are needed in the backup or storage system to increase the flexibility of the power system. So far, most of the renewable energy projects have been funded to the private capital and financed to the local banks. Renewable energy still does not have access to the international project financing, and local interest rates are high at around 6 to 12%. So to meet the needs and plan for the energy transition, the international capital and investment are needed. And Vietnam needs to improve the finance and operational capacity of the local banking sector, focus on improving the financial capacity of the commercial bank. And the bank also needs to focus on applying the project financing mechanism for the clean energy project. So Vietnam also needs to continue to expand and to develop capital market deep. The infrastructure of Vietnam financial market is still limited, and Vietnam also needs to improve the efficiency, competitiveness, and financial capacity of the commercial bank to ensure that the credit institution have sufficient equity capital to improve the risk management capacity at the commercial bank and in accordance with the international standard and practice. They also need to complete the legal framework to be able to develop the green bond mechanism.
Thank you, Nguyen, for a very comprehensive picture of some of the great strides that have been made in Vietnam in renewable energy in the recent year. You also painted a very good picture of what the constraints are if we have to go forward in the same pathway and to meet the energy transition investment requirements. You alluded to capital markets, you alluded to green bonds, and that's a perfect segue for Gilles to make his remarks on how we could tap into these resources, Gilles, to enable that. You had a very nice scene setter example, but very specific to energy transition, what could be done? This is to Gilles. Gilles, please, your remarks.
Yeah, technician, can you bring me in? Thank you, Kavita. And I think I will rebound on what Andrew and Yen have just said. The dominant voice that we hear all the time, developers complain that financing is not available. And banks complain that there is no project. What it shows, in my view, is the dominant voice comes from international renewable energy developer and international banks. But actually, if you look at what Vietnam has achieved over the last 2 years, when they came out with their solar program and the template PPA, everybody said it won't be done, it can't be done, the PPA is not bankable. 2 years later, we have 4.5 gigawatts. And yes, Andrew mentioned there are issues. Curtailment is an issue, but capital was mobilized to build 4.5 gigawatts. And yes, there are some risks, and those risks needs to be addressed, but the energy transition is bigger. It is happening. And we need to enlarge the pools of capital that are available to finance the energy transition. The energy transition will be achieved with international companies, with local companies, with international banks, with local banks, with the loan market, with the capital markets. And we need to work on developing the green finance ecosystem. So Nguyen mentioned training banks in Vietnam around providing non-recourse financing, perhaps work on the policies to encourage Vietnamese banks to develop the project finance market. It will also be interesting to see what will happen to the solar tender in Myanmar that's just been issued. Again, an ambitious 1 gigawatt program. The PPA is, by international standards, slightly better than Vietnam, but not quite bankable yet when it comes to the termination payments. Let's see, trying to match the right kind of project with the right pool of capital. And maybe the right pool of capital will be slightly more expensive than international project finance debt. But as the price for renewable energy continues to come down, well, maybe the cost of debt we can afford a little higher cost of debt. So really, let's look beyond the dominant voice. The transition is happening. It's a lot more than renewable energy. Andrew mentioned investments into the grid, EV charging, and a lot of other sectors that will contribute to that, and try to match those projects with the right source of capital.
Thank you, Gilles. You touched upon really very great points, and beyond the views that were presented by the Philippines and the Vietnam governments. The fact remains that despite some of the challenges and the weaknesses of the frameworks in this region, capital is being mobilized. Energy transition is well on its way, and it's an idea whose time has come. And if the frameworks get improved, it can have the potential to grow exponentially, because as Andrew and you have mentioned, different types of capital can be mobilized and they can come in and crowd in. What is needed is a landscape view of the policy infrastructure and the capacity that needs to be mobilized behind it. So we had a very excellent panel discussion with 4 of the panelists presenting different points of view. Some of the key points that came across was that international lessons are important, but they are not the only innovations that are happening. Despite some of the international standards of PPA and frameworks not being met, capital did get mobilized in the region. So there are potentially new ways to do renewable, new ways to do energy transition. Andrew also mentioned the need potentially for the sovereign wealth to come in and step up in this field much more than that has been possible. And the international support. The governments stand ready and they have been making some ambitious target, but there is potentially, because of the crisis, it can actually be increased to stimulate the green economy. So with that summary, I would like to bring Camilla back into a question for a few comments at the end of this. Camilla, what are your views? How do you think, what has been the UK's experience, and how do you think this can be moved forward from here?
Thanks very much, Kavita. Really interesting discussion so far. And apologies to people viewing that there was a technical hitch at the beginning, so I'm not sure that my remarks were captured apart from to the panelists, which is not really the right thing. But yes, so I lead in the region here the UK's Asean Low Carbon Energy Programme, which is focused on policy support, technical assistance and capacity building on green finance and energy efficiency. So we're working very much through all of these areas. And I think something that I would like to say is that, green finance, we've heard at ASEF all week, all these exciting ideas of what's happening on clean energy, but also highlighting the need and potential to do just so much more. And obviously, finance is the key to that, especially when government budgets at the moment are so strained with sort of health, dealing with health, jobs and livelihoods. So I think in the discussion that we're going to have, and please do, people that are listening, put in some questions to be part of this discussion. We need to think about green recovery in Asia and how we can contribute to and accelerate a clean and more resilient future. and not lock in fossil fuels for the sort of coming generations. And I think that something like $200 billion per year that ADB estimates Southeast Asia will require every year until 2030 to ensure that all new infrastructure is sustainable and able to withstand the impacts of climate change. And obviously there are sort of huge benefits as well in terms of the region's economies, jobs, environment, and to lift people out of poverty, particularly women and disadvantaged groups. And so this mobilization of green finance is absolutely critical. So those are my sort of key points. I would encourage people to use the Q&A facility. It'd be great to make this a very sort of lively and dynamic discussion, and we would welcome comments from people watching and listening to this. Thank you.
Thank you, Camilla. That was a very good experience sharing from the UK and the support that UK government's LCEP is providing in this region. UK government's also a partner of the Southeast Asia Energy Transition Partnership. And I think there's a growing recognition that the challenge of climate and keeping the climate safe is a global problem, and more cooperation and collaboration can enable that. You spoke about the UK experience also, and it reminds me that came just after the last financial crisis, and the stimulus that was released then helped kickstart the market there. And within 10 years, it has transformed itself. So it's really possible to do that. Paula, may I invite you next for a question, if you had, on the experiences that were shared by Andrew or Teals, on what types of capitals could come in and be mobilized and how that might apply to Philippines.
Yes. Okay. Okay, thanks. Kavita, just a question for Andrew maybe, or anyone from the panel. For example, for the Philippines right now, we're trying to craft a green finance work plan. Like, how do we entice private sector money to come in, for example, for sustainable investments? Now, if just a background, the Philippines is a highly vulnerable country, and we have different types of natural risks. And I think this is one of the reasons why our price or the cost of money for capital investment is very costly. Now, for us from the finance department and the central bank, what we're trying to do is look into ways on how we could help private proponents, for example, access these types of finance, like as what we were talking about earlier, green bonds or other sustainable bonds. But I think it's not yet very clear for everyone on how actual project proponents can access this, and how could government leverage its powers, for example, via incentives or through other government policies to help enable the inflow of private investments towards these types of infrastructure.
Andrew, do you want to take that question?
Yes, sure, Kavita. Thanks, Paula. You know, I think Philippines and we've experienced, we've invested into solar projects in the Philippines already, whereby the feed tariff that was used to incentivize international and domestic private capital, I think that was a good first step. We can take lessons from other parts of the world. And you talk about cost of capital. It's all about obviously continuing to reduce cost of renewables, which we're seeing, to make them more competitive than fossil fuels. So I think the transition in the Philippines, as it will be for the markets, is to move from a subsidy-based system to auctions. We've seen the success in the Middle East of just how cheap, effective solar has become through auction processes. I think the key is a clear, transparent process where it can drive true competition, and that I think is something that I think for these in the Philippines, auctions are good. And of course, generally, to continue to drive across all aspects, we need a carbon. It's certain countries are different parts of carbon tax, but that is something arching policy around the region. We need a carbon tax to continue to drive down costs and to incentivize people to transition. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew. As you said, the movement starting with FIT is a very good policy mechanism to encourage the investment, but then it needs to follow through with the auction framework and then with carbon pricing to continue the reduction in the cost of capital and continue the interest of the investors into this sector. This has been a very good start of this panel discussion. We also have another panel discussion coming up, and I will close the discussion for this for now and turn it over to Gilles, who will moderate the next panel discussion. Gilles Pascal, as Camilla introduced, is the partner EY and also the director of the UK's Low Carbon Energy Programme. Gilles will introduce his panel now. Gilles, over to you.
Thank you, Kavita. So my pleasure to continue the discussion with four panelists. We have Kun Pania Nitiwaonakun from the Securities and Exchange Commission of Thailand. She's an assistant director in the bond department, and she's responsible for the sustainable finance activities. And Salma Maidin, who's an executive director from the market development team department at the Securities Commission in Malaysia. We have Pak Iwan Adisaputra, who's a senior advisor at Castle Rock Consulting, and is the brokerage trend lead for the Mentary program, which is the UK government program that looks after renewable energy and financing in Indonesia. And we have Dr. Isabelle de Lovin-Fosse, from the UK government, who's the head of the COP26 strategy and sustainable finance for Southeast Asia, based in Singapore. So to continue the discussion first on the mobilizing the finance and the capital market, I'd like to hear from Kun Pania first, and then from Salma. To hear from Kun Pania and Salma about what is happening on the ground in Thailand and Malaysia on the green bond market, on the sustainable finance market. Have we reached a tipping point in 2019? Have you seen an acceleration over the last couple of years? And what are the level of activity and your priorities respectively over the next 12 to 24 months? Can I ask Pania in Bangkok first?
Yes, hi, hello, Jules. Thanks for inviting me here. As for the sustainable finance market in Thailand, I think for the past couple of years, it's been remarkable. I remember the first time I met Jules, maybe a couple of years ago. We asked him why green bond, and your answer is like, in 5 years, the green bond is going to be the mainstream. And now, at the moment, I think the situation is really getting to that stage. In last year, 2019, the number of bonds of green bond is growing like 3 times from 2018. And I think we've seen a lot of changes in the past 2 years. Like 2 years ago, the industry is asking, what's the green bond? What is it? And last year, the question is, how do I issue a green bond? And I think in the coming year, the question is going to be directed to those who are not issuing green bonds, like, why don't you issue green bonds? So things are really changing now. And I guess the success part of it come from the fact that every people is seeing the real success case. Like, for example, one of our green bond issuers have received more than 8 times subscriptions, and they enjoy the benefit of widening the investor base. Like 1/3 come from the new investor. The investors never invested in their bonds before. And the other thing is we got a strong cooperation in this from the stakeholders like regulators, underwriters, and issuers and investors as well. We also got a good cooperation from many international bodies like ADB, UK Prosperity Fund. We have organized many seminars and workshops to create awareness and create more insights into what's the benefit and how to issue green bonds to the issuers and underwriters. And we also work closely with the many government agencies in Thailand, like Public Debt Management Office, in supporting the government and state enterprise to issue the green bond and social bond. And tentatively, I think that there will going to be like 3 to 4 deals from government and SOE this year. So yes, I think that the situation is changing in a good way, and we will see a huge potential for the green bond market to grow in Thailand, especially in the renewable energy areas. Mm-hmm. Yes, that.
Thank you very much, Kunpaniya. I'm very glad to hear that the question is you feel that we've reached a tipping point, and that soon the question will not be why a green bond, but the question will be why are you not doing green bond? Salma, does that match your feelings and the level of activity that's happening in Malaysia? You've also been blessed with quite a few issuances in the last couple of years. The Securities Commission came out with the SRI Sukuk framework. What's the current level of activities and mood in Kuala Lumpur?
Thank you, Gil. First of all, thank you to the organizers for including Securities Commission Malaysia in this conversation. And I think it's the same explanation that was provided by our Thai colleague. I think the attention to this area continues. I think the SRI Sukuk framework that you mentioned that we put out a couple of years ago, it provides guidance on the issuance of green, social, and sustainable projects. In 2019, we saw 4.77 billion ringgit issued. That's cumulative, including the issuance of the world's first corporate green sukuk that we saw. I think we continue to look for incentives. I think in this area, the framework has been put out. The conversation that at the earlier panel about concerted efforts about the role of sovereign, we continue to have that discussion, encouraging why not green first. We are looking at enabling environment through incentives to encourage that shift and that change of behavior. The government has put in place tax incentive for the issuer of the SRI Sukuk. They can deduct issuance costs against income. I think it's a conversation that must continue, and it is continuing. We are to encourage more green SRI Sukuk issuance. We've established a green Sukuk grant scheme to enable the external review cost to be deducted. It's an area that requires a lot more awareness on standards that's been developed, and that's an area that we will continue to focus on, the capacity building. The role of sovereign is important to access the capital market because of their understanding of risk management, integrating ESG risks into their modeling, the pricing of the assets, and enabling them to I suppose take the first step before markets come in, the remaining markets come in. One of the, very quickly I want to raise is the focus that we have on the next level, the alternative funding space. That's an area that we've focused on quite a bit, especially for the SMEs in funding the frontier market. It's become of greater urgency because of the recovery phase that we are coming out of, and the difficulties faced by the SMEs to tap traditional market. Through our equity crowdfunding and peer-to-peer. We've been able to connect traditional untapped pools of investors to this space. I just want to quickly share that at the end of April 2020, we've seen 7 green technology companies and 18 social purpose companies successfully raising funding in this area. Incentive programs continue to be required. We recently, through our platform, My CIF program, we changed the co-investment criteria from an initial 1 to 4 to 1 to 2. This enables viable issuers to continue to be funded. And lastly, we lifted funding limit on our ECF platform from 10 million from 5, so rather to 10 million from 5 million. I think the conversation for the next 12 months will be improving on standards, disclosure, and for certain capacity building. Thank you, Gils.
Brilliant. Thank you, Salma. Very glad to hear about your enthusiasm and your positivity on the development. It's also great to hear that you're recognizing the need for the entire market to benefit from green finance, including the SMEs and not just the large corporates, because everyone has a role to play. And obviously, the Securities Commission and the government in Malaysia are putting out the right incentives to develop the market. You mentioned your priorities over the next 12 months, disclosures, more capacity building, just raising the level of awareness. If I can stay with you, Salma and Kunpania, if we look at the development of the ecosystem, right, you need corporates, you need, of course, the role of governments, you need corporates to change their business plan and transition to low carbon. You need banks to arrange the bonds, sell the bonds, or even loans, and you need investors. If we look at this ecosystem, is there any constraints? So we're in 2020, June 2020. Is there any constraints from your point of view that needs to be addressed, and by whom? Or do you feel like the entire ecosystem is moving towards low carbon transition? Salma?
I don't believe it to be constrained as such, rather than the raising of awareness on the importance. I think the different parties have bought into the proposition. In fact, on the retail side, we've seen SRI retail funds being launched. I think we've had 3 retail funds and 3 funds for the sophisticated market. Therefore, we do see it as demand. I think the focus would be on 2-pronged, the ability of the asset managers to show performance. That is critical. I think coupled with the idea that the investors are wanting to make a difference. I think what we've lived through, it's certainly an important element in investment consideration. So it is coming together of those. I don't see them as barriers as much. For sure, there is willingness, but I think it must be evidence-based. As such, we are pushing for data analysis. We have something in the pipeline to create more awareness through data. I think evidence-based information is critical. Like, we are dealing with a range of investors who are more attuned to their own focus, but I think still focused very much on performance.
Thank you, Salma. Evidence-based will accelerate. There is awareness, and once we have evidence, it will accelerate the take-up. Kunpania, would you share the same feeling, or do you still see a couple of constraints in the Thai market?
Thanks, Jules. For Thailand, well, as I say, that we have seen a lot of kicking in from issuers, but I think there might still be a tiny bit of challenges in terms of like the extra costs and additional working procedures for those issuers who have to, in order to build the credibility of this bond. So what we are doing is we are coordinating with the international bodies to support the cost of this external review, and also providing the technical know-how. So hopefully once they got started, once they did it, then the next time for them is going to be easier, and they will feel that they can do it in the long term. And the other thing is that for our Thai market, I feel that the underwriters is actually the key jigsaw since building this. So when we build the capacity buildings, we try to include the potential underwriters, because once we train them, it's like we train the trainers so they can spread out the message to the issuers, and that will create a multiple impact for the markets. The other thing is that in terms of the Thai listed companies, I like to share that we have like a total of 20 listed companies that are selected into the Dow Jones Sustainable Index, and I think it's a good trend for this. But I think we will not stop there. We will impose the mandatory disclosure for the sustainable disclosure in a few years. So hopefully when there is mandatory disclosure, a lot more listed companies going to improve on this and will incorporate the ESG in their strategy as well. The last bit is the investor side. I think as our SEC Malaysia has said that the investor is for Thailand, the institutional investors' demand on ESG is improving, but we need a bit more push. And I think one push is that how can they show that the performance on the ESG investment is really good for the long term. This is the one thing that they need. And the one thing that can push this is probably the incentive might help on this. And we need at the same time, we also need to create seminars and capacity buildings to really create awareness on the benefits of investing in these ESG products. And the other thing is that we are trying to build a bulletin platform for the ESG products. So if any investors are interested in investing in the ESG products, they can come and see from this bulletin. So it will facilitate the investors who want to get access to the information relating to the ESG investments. That's one of the plan that we are going to do. Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Kun Pania. Let's get the mood in Jakarta now. Pak Iwan, you have an interesting position because as the brokerage lead for the Mentari program, you're trying to match projects and sources of financing. We know that Indonesia was successful with a very large sovereign green bond, but generally there is a feeling that the transition is slow otherwise. What's the reality that you see on the ground, Pak Iwan?
All right. Good morning, everybody. Thanks, Gilles, for the opportunity for me to, share the Indonesian perspective about this unique topics. So Indonesia is very complete in terms of renewable energy resources. Supposedly, by having that abundance of resources, we should have developed more RE projects. However, the main obstacle is for the RE projects or developer, especially for the small or less developed, they do not properly manage or identify the risk. This is due to the government regulation policy sometimes is not too clear on promoting the RE. And that's why the policy strand under the Mentari support that. And on the other hand, on the financing itself, I think not the main issues of that, but the readiness of the bankability of the project itself is the main constraint. And that's why the brokerage will play important roles how to improve the bankability of the project itself. Some of the main obstacles that the developers are facing today, and also the financial look at that, is because of the tariff is not so investor friendly, I can say. And that's why government now is reviewing the tariff to attract more investment. In fact, the international financing especially are not main obstacles to invest. There's a lot of appetite for them to invest in Indonesia. But again, that the readiness, the bankability of the projects itself is the main constraint. And looking at the domestic financing, the conventional financing from the local banks, they perceive the risk of RE is still high. So project financing is not familiar yet in Indonesia. And that's why I think one of the alternatives we should have a green bond for energy particularly is the breakthrough to develop or to promote the RE. One of the roles of Mentari now is we are supporting PLN. PLN is the Indonesian state utilities company to issue the first ever green bonds in the near futures. That boosts, I think, the appetite for development of RE. And then again, even though the tariff that PLN or the government will improve, but PLN has to be also incentivized to purchase power from the renewable energy. So that is mostly the points that we would like to raise about the RE development, and then in financing in Indonesia. Green bond is one of the alternatives to boost the RE development, even in this difficult situation. PLN or Indonesian demand after the COVID-19 or during the COVID-19 has dropped significantly, especially for the big island like Jawa, Sumatra. But so far, Mentari program will focus in the eastern part of Indonesia, including the off-grid peaks. That is the, thanks for the, opportunity to share the Indonesian perspective.
Thank you, Pak Iwan. So I think we've heard from people based in Bangkok, Kuala Lumpur, and Jakarta, and I think a couple of things that I noted is that the market, it's the whole ecosystem that needs to move at the same time to encourage wider adoption. So the cooperation between the governments, the investors, the banks, the corporates, and a couple of tools that are required include, the disclosures, the incentives, the capacity building. If I can turn now to Isabel. Isabel, in your role as, to prepare the COP26, can you tell us about the priorities of COP26 and the activities that you will be, supporting over the next 12 to 18 months? And I believe you have a presentation, you have a slide to share, so if the technician can.
Thank you, Jill, for the introduction. So I'm delighted to be here at the end of this very busy week for ASEF. And as COP26 presidency, the UK is really committed to be ambitious in what we can collectively achieve on green finance. So a lot is already happening. We've seen that earlier, but we're really ambitious into what we want to be doing. So the challenge we face, and we'll discuss a little bit about the challenge, is how to speed up progress towards a zero emission and climate resilience global economy, while at the same time we want to continue to be creating jobs and supporting the economies through this low carbon transition. And this is particularly important now as a result of the current pandemic. So finance is a key to delivering the successful negotiations package at COP. So it's one of the negotiation areas that is the more tricky to unlock. And we will need to create a sense that increased ambition can be financed and that the support to developing countries is stepping up to meet that challenge. So as we've discussed at the beginning of this workshop, there is currently a huge gap between the financing needs and the actual finance flows to low carbon. Too much money still flows to carbon-intensive sectors or to companies without a plan to get to net zero, and not enough to financing green and resilient activities. So this is partly because those allocating capital in the public or the private sectors are still not factoring climate considerations enough in their decision making, or it can be because governments have not yet set strong policy signals to shift the market. So between now and COP26, which will be in November 2021, the UK will encourage more climate actions, especially on green finance, through a number of campaigns. And this is what the slides present here. So under the Energy Transition Campaign, we will bring governments, development banks, and investors together to accelerate the shift of financial flow away from financing coal, to scale up investment in clean energy, while at the same time supporting a just transition for the coal-intensive economies, particularly in Southeast Asia. For this campaign, we are building on an existing group of governments and businesses that have already joined the Powering Past Coal Alliance. If we work together, we can unlock the billions of dollars we've talked about that are needed to transition to a cheaper and cleaner energy system. On the Nature-Based Solutions campaign, we will scale up private and public financial support for nature-based solutions. These solutions are really no-regret solutions. They have multiple benefits. They support livelihoods, they reduce vulnerability to climate disasters, and they deliver carbon saving. But despite this potential, only 3% of the global finance is spent on nature-based solutions. So we will work with other donor countries to raise global contribution to nature-based solutions, and we will also work with developing countries to help them develop a pipeline of high-quality nature projects that can be financed. Under the Adaptation and Resilience campaign, we will turn the political ambition set out at the UN Climate Action Summit call for action last year into a tangible actions on the ground, in particular on green finance solutions for adaptation and resilience. We will seek a larger share of climate finance for adaptation and resilience projects. We will mobilize capital markets. Basically, we recognize that capital markets is not a substitute for increased public finance, but it will be critical to reach the scale we need to meet the Paris Agreement goals. So the UK is leading by example here, as we have ourselves doubled our international climate finance contribution to at least 11.6 billion by 2026. And we will encourage businesses to ensure that the infrastructure investments are resilient, working with the Coalition for Climate Resilient Investments and other industry-led initiatives. And finally, on adaptation resilience, we will accelerate the green finance solutions to improve early warning systems to avoid climate disasters, working notably with the Risk-Informed Early Action Partnership. So finally, under these three kind of thematic campaigns, we will be drawing on the UK's leadership and pioneering work on green finance to accelerate the greening of the global financial systems we've been talking about. And we will focus this campaign on 5 pillars. So the first is that we basically need to ensure that the donor fulfill the existing ICF commitments, and then to launch the negotiations on the post-2025 goals. Secondly, we want to mobilize greater volumes of financial flows through public-private partnerships that helps to de-risk the investments and to scale up the pipeline of bankable projects, especially in developing countries. And finally, we aim to ensure that every financial decision takes climate change into account by improving the quantity and the quality of reporting on climate-related risks, building, for instance, on the existing task force on climate-related financial disclosure. And we also work on ensuring that the new climate-related financial risk management tools that are mainstreamed through the financial sectors. So these tools can be more mainstream through the financial sector. And then finally, we will encourage firms and investors to measure more accurately the financial return they can expect by using green finance. So this is a very ambitious program for COP26, and it will require cross-economy efforts, and every company, bank, insurer, investor to change the way they operate. But it's really positive to hear what you all said before, that actually this transition is already happening in Southeast Asia, and that the capital is increasingly being mobilized to green and resilient economy. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Isabel. I think we'll take questions. We have about 15 minutes or so left, and there's been quite a few questions posted online. Keep them coming. But if I can start with the need for cooperation and the cooperation within a country. The question is, in Malaysia and Thailand, and I think Paola will also add you and the Philippines. So in Malaysia and Thailand, how well coordinated are the initiatives between the different regulators, financial, energy, and the respective governments? And how can we further enhance this coordination at the country level between the ministry to create a strong joint understanding towards moving to clean energy? Salma, would you like to give the Malaysia initiative angle?
Sure, Gils. Thank you very much. I think we recognize that renewable energy is an area that is fairly nascent in this country. There's little experience in the financial sector with this fairly unknown, and the capacity building in terms of low carbon technology is therefore crucial, I think, which is why collaboration is the way to go between the various segments in the capital market and across the financial markets. In that regard, we have established a joint cooperation with the Central Bank of Malaysia. There's a collaborative effort between Bank Negara Malaysia and the Securities Commission to look at this area. We've established a joint committee on climate change. It has participation from capital markets, banking, and insurance industry. The JC3, as we've called it, has stated intentions to explore coordinated solution in building climate resilience, including greater harmonization of standards. Again, it's the idea of increasing awareness, coming up with taxonomy, developing standards to move this conversation forward.
Asek, Paola, do you have a similar initiatives in the Philippines?
Yes, we support what our colleague from Malaysia has stated. And it's true that collaboration is really important. Like for us, we have what we call the Green Force. So it's an interagency forum as well that plans to create a financial roadmap for green initiatives. So it's very important as in terms of taxonomy. How do you measure climate initiatives, for example? How do you measure social impact and carbon sequestration, or how do we credit carbon? So these are things that we need to work together with, especially with the Securities and Exchange Commission as well as the central bank. At the same time, we have to take in also the suggestions of our colleagues from the climate change commissions, because they're the more experts on how do we craft for our nationally determined contribution, as well as the Economic Development Authority, because they're in charge of what plans, programs do we have for the next, for example, until 2040, the next few years. So we have the Philippine Development Plan. So climate change initiatives as well as renewable and sustainable goals are also embedded in this Philippine Development Plan. So from the finance and the budget department, we also have to coordinate with them for us to properly monitor and see which areas need financing from domestic markets, which needs international funding. So coordination is very important in the Philippines as well.
Okay, great. Kun Pania, do you have a similar formal coordination across government agencies, or is it informal? I mean, we've heard about the JC3 in Malaysia and the Green Force in the Philippines. Do you have such an initiative in Thailand?
Yes, thanks, Jules. We have organized a formal working groups and task force in many levels. Like for example, the first level is between main regulators like financial regulators, banking regulators, and also Ministry of Finance and insurance regulators as well. So this will be like at the national level. And for the capital markets, we also have another working group that formed between stakeholders in capital markets in order to drive the implementations, especially for the capital markets. And one more thing is that I think we can leverage on the success that Thailand has on the renewable energies, as we in the past the government have like special subsidies for like the pricing subsidy for these renewable energies, and also have a special funds for the banking sectors for them to lend at the affordable cost for the renewable energy. So that's why we have a lot of credit lines that from banking sectors that are launched to these renewable sectors. And for the capital markets, as we have been proactively on supporting this sustainable finance market, as you may already seen the figures for 2018 and 2019, we have seen a lot of green bonds that are from renewable energies in, like, for example, winds and solar farms. And yes, so I think it's two things between cooperations, and also the signals from the government is also another important things.
Thank you. Kavita, you've been monitoring the questions posted. Do you mind picking the next one?
Thank you, Gilles. Very involved audience, I must say, with lots of questions coming in. One of the most interesting questions that I think I can take up now for the panelists, especially for the regional representations that we have here, is on whether a greater alignment and coordination of renewable energy policies across ASEAN may actually help lower the cost of capital for the region. And I was just reminded of a Goldman Sachs note released on June 16, which says, you know, globally, the cost of capital for renewable has fallen to as low as 3%, whereas the cost of capital to fossil is increased to 20% because of what has happened in the recent past months. But ASEAN still not getting to take the advantage of it. So the question I will take to Assistant Secretary Paula, Nguyen, and hopefully maybe Kumpania and Salma might answer that at the end, whether there is a need for a more aligned policy on renewable energy across ASEAN. Assistant Secretary Paula, may I turn to you for that first, and then I'll ask Nguyen to comment on it as well.
Okay. For the ASEAN, I think generally we have a lot of cooperations happening, because we were very active in the ASEAN group, or for example, we have the disaster risk resiliency in the ASEAN as well. In terms of renewable energy, I think we just need more fine tuning, because the definitions, for example, although we have the ASEAN Green Bond Standards, which sets the definition for infrastructure in terms of sustainable infrastructure, as a whole, I think for renewable energy, we still need to fine tune what each of us would consider as a general form of taxonomy. So, but I don't think it's impossible, or I don't think it's in the far future. I think it's in the near future, because the ASEAN group is very cooperative in terms of regional integration.
Thank you, Paula. Nguyen, may I ask you to comment on that? Vietnam has been the chair for ASEAN this year. Any comments on any movements on coordination on RE policies across ASEAN?
Yes. Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. So yeah, actually, Vietnam is the host for the ASEAN energy meetings this year. So I can see that the government is actively to have some like very creative activity and discussion about what the ASEAN, what kind of the policy or what kind of tool that the ASEAN country can to accelerate renewable energy in ASEAN. So there are some discussion about the interconnection within the ASEAN, so that in the future we can share the renewable energy in grid, and there are some discussion about how we can build up the CO2 market in the ASEAN, and some kind of like exchange green bond in the ASEAN. So I think that's policy quite important and needed for the future development of the renewable energy in ASEAN.
Thank you, Nguyen. So it seems you are reinforcing the view presented by Assistant Secretary Paula that this movement has begun, and maybe in near future we will see more evidence of it. Khun Panya, do you want to comment on that as well? And what you think Thailand also tried something last year as its chair on renewable energy and energy transition? Khun Panya?
Okay, thanks. Yes, as you has kindly mentioned, I think the sustainable finance has been like one of the priority of many ASEAN countries. That's why we have formed the ASEAN Sustainability Roadmap for Capital Markets, and I think many of the initiatives are to build the asset class in terms of sustainable finance, to create visibility for the asset class. And one of the initiatives that I think could be helpful for the renewable energy is that apart from green bond, where we have financing channels for those who want to build renewable energies, we also have in ASEAN initiative to support for the transition bonds, where those who are not green yet, but have a plan to transit towards more greener activities, like a more efficient way of energy, so they can still find the finance, but in the long run, I think they have to turn to the clean energy. But in the short run, if they cannot, they can still find these financing channels in a useful way, in order to turn their activities to a greener ways.
Thank you, Khun Panya. Last but not least, Salma, do you want to add something about any other ideas or thoughts on greater coordination in ASEAN?
Only to repeat our Thai colleagues' point about the ASEAN roadmap, I think the immediate rollout would be talking about the corporate the sustainability disclosure, perhaps even developing the stewardship codes. I think very important is increasing market access. We can learn from the success that we've had on the ASEAN CIIS framework to push this forward.
Excellent. Thank you for that. Gilles, do you have any other questions that you've been monitoring that you want to ask the panel?
Yeah,
and maybe finally hand over to Camilla.
Maybe one for Andrew. I mean, I think on the need for cooperation, clearly on green finance, ASEAN has been successful with the ASEAN Green Bond Standards. That's an example of regional cooperation. They've also been on the energy side, setting a common target of achieving 23% on the energy mix. Now, the policy response will be at the individual country level, because we also have a large diversity. Every currency is different. The banking market is different. So the way the policy will support on renewable energy development will probably be developed at the local level. Andrew, going back to renewable energy and investments in the region, perhaps you can comment on, would you like to see uniformization of the different renewable energy targets and supporting policies? And from your point of view as an investor, can you comment on, feed-in tariff, auction, renewable portfolio standards? In your view, within ASEAN, how can we promote? Is there a uniform response, or do we need to take into account the local specifics? And what, from an investor point of view, what is most appealing?
Thanks, Gio. Actually, I think uniform policy across all the markets is not practical. I think the reality is in Southeast Asia that countries are still developing at a different pace and have a lot of competing agendas within the country which need to be taken into consideration. I think, of course, there is a common goal, and there can, yes, these common goals and common objectives. And I think where it's important is as countries make progress, that other countries look to see what can be replicated and how it can be adapted. So I'm a big fan of more sharing. And, for example, we have taken delegations of whether it be banks, bank representatives, policymakers who visit projects and investments that we've made in the region. And I think it's that practical sharing which actually helps a great deal. So I think a uniform policies, but I think it's that knowledge sharing and experience sharing on a practical level, which to your second point on tariffs, to move beyond tariffs, subsidies, and especially the amount of subsidies that are used for fossil fuels, we can start there. And, we unfortunately live in which still, coal-fired power is abundant. So first of all, I know it's a tough one for policymakers, but we've got to cut out these fossil fuel subsidies and at the same time move beyond subsidies generally into a power price market. So I think even from an investor point of view, it's all about being able to see the trajectory of policy. And if we're going towards auctions and competitive processes across the region, I think that's something that will be beneficial to all.
Thank you, Andrew. And I guess it's back to you, Camilla.
Thank you very much, Gilles. Thank you. So thank you, everybody. I think we're at the end of our deep dive workshop. Thank you very much indeed for joining us. Thank you to all the panelists. I think we've had a really rich and interesting discussion. Thank you for the questions that have been fed in. Thank you to Gilles and Kavita for chairing. I'm really encouraged by the work that is happening in the region, and it's really exciting, though a bit daunting about what more needs to be done, but that is happening. We've talked a lot about collaboration over the last hour and a half, and for the UK government, I think we really look forward to working further with regulators and ministries and businesses to support this sort of green finance need across Southeast Asia. Two ways we'll do that in particular, I think, through the sort of finance ambition that we're going to be driving through our COP26 presidency, and through the low carbon energy programs in Southeast Asia that we are already running. So look out for the work that we're going to be doing on that. Thank you again to all the panelists. Really appreciate your time and expertise, and also to the ASEF organisers. Thank you. Bye-bye.